Hello, this is Tom Cheshire, standing in for Neil Patterson. On today's Daily, we're talking about a conflict that, frankly, doesn't get talked about enough: Sudan. It's a country in northeast Africa where millions of people have been displaced and tens of thousands, at least, have been killed. Sky News has teamed up with investigative reporters at Lighthouse Reports, The Washington Post and Le Monde to uncover details of a gruesome massacre which took place last year. This is the first time video evidence has emerged which shows militiamen linked with the rebel RSF, Rapid Support Forces, directly involved in the extrajudicial killings of unarmed civilians. Our Africa correspondent Yousra Elbagir was born in Sudan, in the capital, Khartoum.
My parents lived there at the time that the war broke out, and they had to evacuate, like many of my friends' families, like our neighbors. And I think for everyone that's managed to leave, to see people in the country still trapped, still facing this level of violence, close to 17 months on, is devastating. I mean, people are getting sick just watching it. It was crazy to hear from my parents' doctor that his Sudanese patients, the elderly, were suffering like from heartbreak almost, that their health was just deteriorating.
Yousra, for those who haven't been to Sudan, what is it like as a place to live, to exist?
Sudan is warm. I think that's the only way to describe it. It's a very warm place. It's a very hospitable place. You go to a stranger's house anywhere in Sudan, and not just Khartoum, and you will be very well fed. You'll have a bed offered to you. You will be told, no, you have to stay and be hosted by us. Otherwise, you're offending us. Like the level of generosity and warmth is really, it's really hard to compete with. And being in countries around the region, I do value that more because I see that the scarcity and the conflict and the economic issues and the decades of civil war didn't change that nature. So home for me has really been shaped by that experience, being born there, going back there and going to school there. And it's really, I think, that nature and that kindness has gotten a lot of people through this conflict.
And Darfur is a bit different. Can you tell us about that area?
It's a lot of farming communities. It's very like rich arable land. The cities are very old cities. Al-Fashir, the capital of North Darfur, was the center of a sultanate. It's got a lot of heritage, a lot of history, and the people there are naturally very attached to their land, and that land has been the point of contention and where conflict has erupted, where farmers and herders from Arab tribes have been trying to kind of get control of this, like these hectares and acres of arable land. Reporting this conflict, we've gone to Sudan, and this time I really felt like this entrenched despair that the outrage they expected or the intervention that they expected never came.
So can you take us through what's been happening at the broadest level?
I mean, we had a revolution in 2019 that erupted from a sense of a need for change. And that came from the fact that economically the country had stagnated. So after the revolution, the army head became the de facto head of the state and the head of the RSF. He'd made his way into the capital. So these are the two guys that led our post-revolution transition. And they were meant to hand over power to civilians. They kept putting it off. When the time came that they were meant to hand over to civilian governance, they had a coup, October 2021. And then within their own kind of bubble, they started to fight for control. So what we saw on April 15th was this explosive end to their partnership. And as the days went on, it started to feel like we might not be coming out of this. And that's when there was this mass exodus of people from Khartoum, people from all over Sudan. To look at it now, close to 17 months on, I think we never imagined it would go on like this for this long.
Let's bring in Klaas van Dijken now, Investigations Director at Lighthouse. Can you talk a bit about your part in this, how you went about finding this evidence, verifying it, and what it shows to you?
I've been working on Sudan for more than a decade. Footage like this rarely comes out, but I knew that as somewhere, because the fighters, they film everything they do, so I knew that these kind of videos, they must have been somewhere. Somebody leaked the videos to us. And when I saw the videos, for the first time, I immediately knew, like, okay, this is really important material.
Yeah, I mean, just take us through what's in these videos.
The first one, you can see basically fighters with guns and with swords, and they are cheering over the bodies of people lying on the ground that have been killed just before. There are bystanders hanging over walls of houses, just checking the guys who are cheering. Then a second video is from a man lying on the ground, heavily breathing, and he's bleeding to death. And then there is somebody, well, the person who takes the video, basically mocking him, which is very disturbing to see and to hear. And the third video is the video you already talked about. It's where you can see bodies on the ground with their hands tied behind their backs. A group of people around them. Shots can be seen fired, and these people they are the brothers, the 5 brothers who have been killed.
These videos are gruesome. They're shocking. In the past, we've seen videos where there's this very disturbing racist vitriol being hurled at civilians. They're being rounded up. There have been signs to what we see in these videos. This is a blueprint for what has happened over the last year and a half. It's complete destruction. It's civilians being pulled out of their home. One of the big things about this investigation with Lighthouse was finding the people in the videos and really being able to see that these were just young guys. They just happened to be from a certain tribe and they just happened to be of fighting age. But one of them was as young as 14.
And these are all from the same family, aren't they?
All from the same family. They were hiding in the same room when these militiamen arrived. And their mum told these guys, they said, "Are there any men here?" They were doing a door-by-door hunt for civilian men from the non-Arab tribes. And she said, no, they came back another time. And then the third time they came back, they pulled them out and they didn't put up a fight. They tied their hands, their wrists behind their back before they left. And then they blindfolded them outside and they shot them.
And it's so grim, but it's also so important to make sure that this happened, that where it happened, who it happened to, who was doing this, all this work of verification and investigation. So when you have those videos, how do you go about making sure we can be sure that this is where it happened?
The people who leaked the videos told us that it was part of what's known as the Khartoum massacre. So it happened near the place Khartoum, or at an internally displaced people's camp, Kassab. So the first thing we checked was, okay, has there been a massacre? Where there are killings? And we could find posts online of people mourning the victims of a massacre in early June last year, and then after a while we found a picture of a boy who was wearing a football jersey from Inter Milan, and it was exactly the same jersey that one of the victims was wearing in the video of the 5 brothers. So that was the first step for us to start verifying these videos. We had then a network of people that we called and to ask more information about the region and who could know the exact location, and that's how we started to verify the location of the videos by using Google Maps, for example, to find the exact location of the videos. In the other video where you can see the perpetrators cheering over the bodies, you can see fires, that they set fires to haystacks, and that's also visible from satellite imagery on exactly these dates, on exactly these locations.
It's that amazing sort of forensic digital work. It's a very modern approach to journalism. And part of that too is Yousra, once you have some of this information, going to the refugee camps and combining that with speaking to people armed with all this sort of verified information.
Yeah, I mean, people left the region to come and speak to us, and to be able to sit down and look people in the eye and ask what happened and be able to get that detailed report of what the experience was that day for them. I think it helped us all also really kind of step out of that forensic place and see the humanity of it and see the brutality that these people had experienced and the families being torn apart. I think when we see refugee camps, it's just a mass of people, right? But to be able to at least have one event that people in these camps have experienced, and there'll be many similar events that people have gone through, but just to be able to isolate that one day and see people who still haven't spoken to their family members since that day, it was just really, really shocking.
That's a really good point, that many similar events. And it's the same, Klaas, as your point about, fighters filming everything they do. Because of that sort of, everyone's got a mobile phone, they are recording it. As grim as these videos are, actually now there is testament of what happened on that day, filmed by the fighters themselves, verified by both of you working in slightly different ways. Despite, how depressing it is to see things like this, to understand it's happening in the world, is there some hope in that these are being documented? We have that in perhaps a way we wouldn't have had 20 years ago when no one had a smartphone. Experts
are now really relying on cell phone footage from these areas where journalists can't even get into, right? I think back in the day, Darfur had observer missions. Old school journalists tell me they used to just cross over, just walk in from Chad. We can't do that. It's heavily militarized. It's incredibly unsafe. The militia checkpoints people have to go through to flee. We wouldn't even be able to survive one or two of them, right? So I think having access to that kind of imagery, that kind of footage, and then being able to have even the distance to really just sit down, dissect it, analyze it, study it is a privilege that we can work that way now.
And in terms of videos like this, Klaas, is this something you're still actively looking for, evidence of other massacres, doing the same sort of work to see if it is ongoing?
Yeah, I think that is tremendously important to keep going with this kind of work, especially because the footage is rarely coming out. But it is important to show that this is indeed not just one incident. There are plenty of stories of people who have survived massacres, but most of the time the evidence is circumstantial, and it rarely gets a step further. And I think that's for accountability reasons.
You've interviewed the head of the RSF previously. Can you give a bit of context to that and what you got from that, and especially in the light of the current conflict?
I was in Sudan in the last time I was there, end of 2019, and Hamati, the head of the RSF, just entered Khartoum then, and he was sitting in the palace. He wanted to portray this picture at the time of himself as being a very humble man, somebody of normal people, who was advocating on behalf of the civilians of Sudan. He was a man that spoke very eloquently, very soft-spoken, very kind, but at the same time, he gave this kind of feeling that he was in control of everything that was going on at the moment. He was the most, and is one of the most, or the most powerful and rich man in of Sudan, and I knew this already because I traveled multiple times to Sudan before that, when also the RSF, and then more known as the Janjaweed, the militias who were involved in the genocide in Darfur, were active, and I've spoken to a lot of survivors of the attacks by the RSF in Darfur, and he's definitely a very, very dangerous figure. After I interviewed him, I asked him if I could visit his home, or what he considered his hometown at the time in northern Darfur, and he basically replaced the people that were living there with his own people. So that place, known as Zuruk, was already kind of the blueprint what Sudan would look like if he would come into power. And this is exactly what is happening.
And his hometown is in the same state as Khartoum, where the massacre happened, and where the last battles for control of the region are currently happening.
There's a lot of interest in this. There is this horrifying ethnic cleansing element to it, but there's also about control of resources, about cash at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, we also have an 800-kilometer Red Sea coast, right? We have access to countries across the region. We're a corridor country, but we also have gold. We have uranium. Russia's interest in Sudan also stemmed from their interest in our uranium deposits. It is literally a gold mine for bad actors. And what Hamati has done, which is very similar to what Omar al-Bashir did before him, was he's been just kind of selling off the country and showing that if he's in power, you'll get your access to the Red Sea. You'll get access to gold mines in Darfur. You'll also get access to my militia that will defend the gold mines, that will protect the gold mines. So it is a really dangerous equation. And I think the apathy and neglect that Sudan is getting will come at a very, very high cost.
We'll pause there. And after the break, we'll talk about that apathy, that neglect that Yousra was speaking of. I mean, that apathy and neglect, let's talk about the war we're not talking about. There's a lot going on at the moment. Gaza, Ukraine, and you can argue, especially with Ukraine, that's in Europe, that's natural. It's going to get more attention. And, it's horrifying what's happening there too. Is it because there are so many of these foreign actors, there's not really motivation from outside? I mean, Russia's a Security Council member, and it's also, as it would say, in a proxy war with NATO at the moment. We haven't had that sort of cooperation that was evident, as you were saying, for the 2003 genocide.
You know what, Tom? I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it is. And I didn't want to go for the easy answer, which is racism. But I keep coming back to anti-Blackness and this feeling that we are used to this, or that's just the way things are for Sudan. And that's not true. That's not the case. Even after the genocide in Darfur, there was an impact. People moved back. People stayed there. There are also people who never left in the Darfur genocide of the early 2000s. There was a lot of international outcry, right? We saw celebrities wearing Save Darfur t-shirts. We saw George Clooney, take it on, him and John Pendergast. And it was a real cause for humanity. It felt like people collectively had decided that this was not okay, that this shouldn't go on. And people can condemn celebrity activism, but it had an effect. There were mechanisms. The US designated the conflict as a genocide. There was a UN arms embargo in the western region in Darfur in 2004. There was also a peacekeeping mission, United Nations, African Union peacekeeping mission. So there were attempts to quell the violence, and they definitely had an effect because the people of Darfur were very, very scared when that peacekeeping mission was pulled out by the two men who are currently engaged in this war.
Yeah, and in terms of that fatalism, it's already had a terrible cost already, a year and a half into it. There's research in Europe who said as many as 6 million or 10 million excess deaths. Famine is something we haven't talked about, but which is a real, real worry.
Pressure. And the UN fact-finding mission recommended a peacekeeping force. That intervention for some people in Khartoum, where I'm from, is they have disdain for that kind of intervention, boots on the ground. But the people of Darfur have been asking for that, the return of that, since the UN mission, African Union mission, left. I think there needs to be actual thoughtful intervention that does center civilians and the most vulnerable.
I mean, so that's what needs to happen. It doesn't sound like you're very optimistic that will happen.
I think just because we've seen over the last year and a half that every time we go back, people are increasingly more disappointed. And the reason they share this stuff with us, I mean, the reason they sent the videos to Klaas, the reason that they spoke to me and traveled so far was with the hope that people will heed their call for help, that people will intervene, that the militia still controlling Khartoum, their town, will be called to pay for their actions. We can't promise that because that has not been the pattern in this episode of conflict. But once you put forward this evidence, you can't say that this is an invisible war. This is an ignored war. And I think for the evidence to be presented and for people to then choose not to act is a completely different situation than if people weren't being heard at all.
Sky News approached the RSF for comment on the allegations. Although they haven't replied to Sky News directly, the RSF told the Washington Post, our partners in this investigation, this. The ethnic dimensions of the conflict had been overblown and exploited to manipulate the Western media. And people in Khartoum from different tribes are now living together peacefully, overseen by an RSF commander from the African Fur tribe. That is all for today. We're back again tomorrow.